Thank you very much. Thank you especially to Dorothy, who persisted, even when I said, I don't do anything on Belt and Road Initiative, that I come and speak. So I find it, you must find it very interesting that the two panelists who are speaking on Africa are two Asian women. It's a little weird. Um, but as has been said, I spent 15, almost 16 years living in Africa, mostly in Johannesburg, 3 years in Nairobi, which is where my interest and my work on Chinese people in Africa started. You will have garnered from my name that I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean American, and I ended up in South Africa because my husband convinced me to move there with him for 2 or 3 years. In 1994, 95, I only returned to the US in 2010. In the interest of the possibility of getting cut short, these are my takeaways. I'll just put them up front. According to multiple accounts, there are now at least 1 million Chinese people living in Africa. Some of the media accounts and publications use this figure to raise alarm about the human element of China's, and I put in quotation marks, overreach into Africa. And this, these alarms were raised well before concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative and debt, predatory debt, loans and things like that. So while the primary focus of this conference is the Belt and Road, I want to kind of refocus us on the human element of China-Africa engagement and step back a little bit historically to examine these kinds of various encounters over the years. So what I want to do, again, in terms of my takeaways or the outline is argue that Chinese human presence in Africa goes back at least to the Ming Dynasty, with evidence of trade between China and Africa going back even further, evidence of Chinese ceramics and coins and things like that found on the east coast of Africa over the years. There are multiple different groups of Chinese that make up this estimated 1 million in Africa. There are now Chinese Africans, so these are Chinese Africans of Chinese descent who are second, third, fourth generation on the continent. There are Chinese from the diaspora, so from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Malaysia, and people who look like me on that continent who are always mistaken as Chinese. So, for all of those years that I lived in Africa, I could scream until I was blue in the face that I was Korean American. And after about 5 minutes, people would say, so what part of China was that? And then there are several different groups of Chinese from the mainland who have been going over to Africa in different waves from different places, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. As C.K. Lee pointed out, before BRI, there was the Belt and Road Initiative. There was going out and going global, and what I want to argue is that in addition to Chinese firms going out, Chinese people have also been going out and going global and going to Africa. And I want to tell you a little bit about who these people are and why they're moving to Africa. And as I describe who these people are, I want to emphasize that the boundaries between the Chinese workers, for example, and Chinese independent migrants are quite fluid. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on some of the economic and social and political impacts of these Chinese migrants and Chinese migrant investments on the continent. So I'll just go briefly through this, but the voyages of Zheng He started a long, long time ago. And the Chinese use this imagery and use these narratives to make one important point, is that the Chinese encountered Africa, had these encounters with Africa, traded with Africa, but they never colonized. They came, they met them, they exchanged gifts, and they left. And they left for a long time. They didn't return for quite some time. the next kind of physical presence of Chinese people on the continent was during European kind of colonial and imperial activities on the continent. So Chinese slaves, coolie labor, convicts were the first Chinese who settled in Africa, whose tombstones have been found on the Cape, for example. We were talking about trading companies. The Dutch East Indian Company was the first to import large numbers of Chinese to the southern tip of Africa. In addition to those early periods, if we fast forward a little bit, this is a postcard of Chinese miners who worked in the gold mines on the Rand in South Africa. They were imported, close to 64,000 of them between 1905 and 1910. Almost to a one, they were returned to China, if not standing, then in coffins. 1 out of 20 of those miners died on the mines. And this was a huge project, together with many other similar projects where Chinese workers were under contracts, indenture, if you will, taken to Africa to work. There was evidence, there's evidence in Chinese documentation, but also in these colonial documents of Chinese labor that worked sugar plantations, that helped to build ports in Africa, that helped to build railroads. And so what we're seeing today in some ways is a kind of newer version of this, without the white colonial patrons bringing the Chinese in, but the Chinese or the state or the Chinese themselves moving to Africa voluntarily. If we fast forward again to the post-independence era, the Chinese were very, very involved in African independence movements and very committed to building friendships with African nations. In this photo, these are Chinese workers working literally side by side with African workers to build the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. These post-independence and Cold War era engagements are, again, a big part of China's narrative on their engagements with Africa during the 60s and 70s. There were at least 50,000 Chinese that worked on the Tanzania-Zambia Railway together with many, many Zambians and Tanzanians. So again, we talk about 1 million Chinese in Africa today, but there's a long history of Chinese on the continent. Again, during the Cold War, immediate post-independence period, Chinese health practitioners and other representatives of the Chinese state, as a gesture of friendship, even as they were struggling to develop themselves, sent over healthcare workers and engineers and other people to help their brothers and sisters in Africa to develop. And again, the Chinese state tends to use these kinds of posters in their narrative about the current win-win friendship that they have with Africa. And then I want to also include not just the official Chinese, but to say that there's been trickles of independent Chinese moving to Africa on their own. The first image is of some of the members of one of the Chinese clubs in Johannesburg, taken circa 1900, 1901. So as early as that, there were Chinese who had moved to Africa. Initially, in South Africa, it was with the intention of mining for gold. Gold was discovered in South Africa after the gold rush in California had ended, after most of the gold from Canada and New Zealand had been closed out. So there were Chinese who were looking for opportunities, arrived in what's now South Africa, and then they were denied digging licenses because they weren't white. The big irony, of course, is that in the earlier image, there were Chinese who were imported to work specifically on the mines in South Africa. And then the other image, many of you who know Africa might recognize. It's a politician, Jinping, whose father was Chinese, Chinese businessman who ended up on the continent. So this just to say that there are small numbers, but this influence of Chinese Africans, now second, third, fourth generation, who make their homes there. And then finally, Chinese from the greater diaspora or global China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong. In South Africa, the Taiwanese were invited in during the apartheid era to invest in South Africa, and started many of the textile and clothing manufacturing companies that have now been taken over by many mainland Chinese. But again, this is a presence that often gets conflated with mainland China's engagements in Africa today. So the new Chinese migrants in Africa, who are they? And I put migrants in quotation marks on purpose because, again, as a sociologist, terminology is important. I don't use the term immigration because I think, to me, immigration has a kind of meaning that where there's a little bit more permanence, where someone is choosing to move and become a part of that country. There are many Chinese Africans today, but for many, many years, generations even, they all thought that they would go back, or that their bodies would be sent back to China and be buried there. There's a term in the overseas Chinese literature, sojourner, and in many ways, the Chinese migrants today, I would say, are sojourners. When it comes to expatriates or official representatives of the Chinese state, again, the term migrant isn't necessarily appropriate. Certainly in the migration literature, we don't use that term. But here you have images, again, of Chinese in the healthcare sector, Chinese on working agricultural demonstration projects, and then the numbers of Confucius institutes that have been opened up in at least 20 different African countries over the last decade and a half. So there are, amongst the million, some representatives of the Chinese state. Unless someone's specifically talking about military and security engagements, people seldom think about the Chinese peacekeepers in Africa, but they are now, China now is amongst the world's top 12 largest contributors of troops, and of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China is the biggest contributor of peacekeepers to Africa. Most of China's increased activity in peacekeeping started in about 2017, and is all focused on Africa. And in 2017, China had more than 2,400 troops that were taking part in 7 different UN peacekeeping missions, most notably in Mali and South Sudan. CK talked about this a little bit. A number of the other presentations earlier spoke about Chinese labor in Africa, but this is also a huge proportion of that million Chinese on the continent. Most of the Chinese workers work for Chinese state-owned companies and private companies, again, in construction and mining. Those are the 2 sectors where they tend to work, and where, but as I was speaking to Gude earlier, many of the earlier concerns about China's engagement in Africa included Chinese labor. It was Chinese workers and the numbers of Chinese workers in many African countries where unemployment is upwards of 40, 50%. Obviously, the idea of bringing workers in from some other country to push wheelbarrows and do things like that was of huge concern. Why aren't Chinese creating jobs? This was mentioned earlier in other countries as well. All of the research to date shows that there's a huge process of worker localization. So where it's possible, as quickly as Chinese companies can, they localize the workforce. And it seems to me the findings indicate that Chinese workers are sent to Africa under very specific conditions where either there is no skilled workforce in country, or where the deadlines and the turnaround time for the completion of any specific project are so tight that they can't get local workers to work around the clock. Whereas with workers who are living in these China houses, on these worker compounds, on mines and construction sites, who are on limited term contracts, they can oftentimes get them to work 7 days a week, certainly longer hours. And so it's under very particular circumstances where you still see large numbers of Chinese laborers. The people that I've been doing my research on for the last 15 years or so are the independent Chinese migrants, and many of them in almost every single African country now, most African cities, you will see a China shop, Chinese, a small retail business, a grocery store. This one is called the Housewife Market. Some really good names of shops, like Chinese restaurants. Many of them are setting up these small businesses, grocery stores, small shops selling Chinese-made clothing and accessories, consumer items, and things like that. In Zambia and a few other countries, you see Chinese trying their hand at agriculture. What's very interesting is that these are entrepreneurs, but in China, they had no previous experience running their own businesses. Most of them were employed by some Chinese firm. The people who are going into farming, same thing. Many of them have no previous experience doing these things. They're taking up opportunities where they see them, and they're kind of making their own way. Some of these Chinese migrants have unfortunately engaged in illicit activities. I don't know how many of you would have seen a recent articles about the Ivory Queen, who was just arrested and sentenced to 15 years for her hand in smuggling ivory out of the country. The other picture is of the Chinese who were involved in galamsey, or artisanal mining in Ghana. They were involved, most of them entered the country illegally or were doing the mining without proper permits. There are upwards of 50,000 who have, over a period of 7 or 8 years, been in or through Ghana. In, I think it was 2015, there were 2,400 of them deported back to China. So in my interviews with Chinese ambassadors and other Chinese officials, they talk about the independent Chinese migrants as their biggest headache. That they have no official sponsorship. The Chinese are going out, mavericks, trying to make their way. And again, one of my points is that we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as if it is some big kind of, Chinese plan or plot, the way many people look at it, to take over the world or certain sections of the world a little bit at a time. And as most of the people in this room have said and presented on before, there doesn't seem to be a grand plan. There were a couple projects that were put together, and we can talk about whether it's an umbrella or a bucket. Chinese independent migrants put a huge wrinkle in any kind of plans or plots, because they're out doing their own thing. And so for the official Chinese, the diplomats, this is a challenge for them. I have 5 more minutes, last couple slides. So why are the Chinese flocking to Africa? With the rise of China, you have uneven development and uneven distribution of opportunities. Many of the people that we interviewed over the years who are in China talked about the overcrowding, the congestion in Chinese cities, and the level of competition for jobs. So for them, the possibility of going to Africa and maybe being their own boss is very attractive. Many of the Chinese contract workers make 3 to up to 10 times as much money during that short-term contract in Africa than they can working the same construction job in China. So there are all kinds of motivations and incentives, but most of them are very individual. And it's about trying to find a better life for themselves. For many of us in this room who are also immigrants, first generation, or children of immigrants, it's the same story. And the same reasoning about why our parents left or why we left, right? And again, this is China's big slogan of going out or going global, while unintentionally, intentionally meant for their companies to become multinationals, is also been taken up by individuals to go and seek their fortunes elsewhere. Why Africa? The barriers to entry are much lower. There are much lower costs of setting up shop. All of this at the same time as Western countries are closing their borders or making it much more difficult to enter. There's a much greater potential for return that come together with those higher risks, and many of the Chinese are willing to take those higher risks. In Africa, because there's generally a lower level of development in most African countries, where Chinese migrants might enter the US and have to work at a Chinese restaurant for 10 years before they can make a difference, or wait even longer and hope that their children might do better in the next generation. In Africa, they're not entering the field at the bottom of the barrel. With their little bit of investment, they're still able to kind of be much more on par with your average African, or actually be a boss. So that makes a huge difference as well. And again, if I refer back to all of the interviews that I've done with Chinese migrants over the years, Chinese dreams of wealth, of freedom, but almost every single one of them talked about how clean the air was in Africa, how blue the sky was, and how much space they had. And so this is all part of the contrast between what it's like living in a Chinese city at the moment. And then just a few final observations about these Chinese migrant flows. What we're seeing globally is kind of unprecedented flows. But one of the huge differences is that whereas previous generations of overseas Chinese, the majority came from 3 coastal provinces of China. Now we're seeing migrants from all across China, from the far north, from central China provinces. Most of the Chinese migration flows began with young Chinese men. In this case, there are a lot more women and a lot more families moving to Africa. And as I mentioned earlier, these boundaries between the different groups, the Chinese contract workers and independent migrants, or Chinese diplomats and independent migrants, are very fluid. And oftentimes it involves the same person going to Africa on 2 or 3 different occasions in separate stints. So they might initially go there as the manager of a Chinese mining company and work their 2 or 3 year contract. But having seen what the opportunities are, they'll return to China and then go back to Africa as an independent migrant with a little bit of capital, so they can start their own business. And so these kind of distinctions that I make are, as I said, quite fluid. And then just quickly, very, very preliminary, we're talking about Chinese migrants on the ground now for about 15, maybe 20 years. Most of these, all of these images are from South Africa, but you see local economic impact. So not only from the big Chinese big companies, but also from independent migrants who have now made enough money to make their 2nd or 3rd investment, where you see them starting to move into small manufacturing or real estate development. Chinese shops everywhere. As I mentioned before, almost every single major African capital, there'll be a China section or a Chinatown developing. Chinese shops, a lot of them importing goods, inexpensive goods from China to sell either wholesale and or retail. And then Chinese factories, and Taiwanese factories and local Chinese factories, right? A lot of the cut, make, and trim factories in Lesotho, in South Africa, are owned by Chinese migrants. So again, none of these figures end up in the numbers that are captured by economists when we talk about FDI, right? This is something to remember. So we can talk about, China's Belt and Road Initiative and big Chinese FDI, but there's all of this activity going on the ground. Social impacts, increasingly, the numbers of Chinese-African relationships and children. Just in the last few weeks, I've received numerous images from friends on Instagram of the celebrations for the Chinese New Year in Johannesburg, Chinese Confucius Institutes and things. And then to reiterate a point that somebody, I think CK was making as well, we need to look at individual countries to see where national and local political impacts are being felt. These are two ANC posters that from 2014 and I think 2016. I haven't been able to kind of investigate whether or not these were originated by a Chinese business person who wanted to try to gain influence with the local ANC councillor, or vice versa, where it might have been the idea of a local local ANC councillor who wanted to get some sort of financial kickback or business investment from the local Chinese community. It really makes no sense, because if you're registered to vote in South Africa, you would be able to read and speak English. There are 11 official languages in South Africa, but business and politics mostly still gets done in English. So the idea of Chinese language being used in a political poster and the like is an oddity. But again, these are the kinds of impacts that we need to continue to examine in future. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes, I guess, 4 actually. And just quickly before we take the questions, I just wanted to point out that throughout the 90s, say from 1990 to up to 2000, there were a number of trends in Africa that made Africa really ripe for Chinese presence. One was, this was the era of wars, a lot of civil wars, the Rwandan genocide, Black Hawk Down, the Liberian Civil War, the Africa World War in the Congo. Everywhere across the continent there were a lot of wars. The debt from the 70s had grown all throughout the 90s, and at that point, in fact, at the beginning of the early aughts, there was this drive to waive the debt, the Jubilee movement. But beyond the war, beyond the debt, there was also the disease burden. HIV/AIDS was basically ravaging Central and Southern Africa at the time, besides malaria, tuberculosis. So from the West and from the US, when they looked at Africa, US policy toward Africa, Western policy toward Africa was actually through humanitarian and development lenses. It wasn't through trade and business. It was this context in which the first FOCAC, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, was hosted in the year 2000 when China announced this going out policy. So African need for infrastructure. Africa still lacks the rest of the world in every coverage of infrastructure. Africa still needs heavy investment. When African countries were cut off from global capital, Chinese capital made that advancement in Africa. And so even today, if Chinese investment were to suddenly stop on the continent, there is no direct replacement for Chinese investment in Africa. That the relationship has some issues and those issues need to be worked out is clear. But I'm saying tentatively that China's presence on the continent has been a net positive. I'm going to keep saying that until I have evidence to change it. So we're going to take a couple of questions. And any questions? I don't see any takers. We'll go with her. Let's start with her. He's spoken like 2 or 3 times, so let's start with her.
Hi, great presentations. Appreciate your contribution. This question, I guess, it could be for either of the speakers. I'm just curious, at the time that global capital retreated during the financial crisis, how are wages actually paid in Zambia? Were they paid in local currency? Were they paid in dollars? And for the workers in the mines, since that sector seemed to have the highest wage in the country, and they had greater leverage over their ability to negotiate, could they then negotiate during that time for wages to be paid either in dollars or how?
Local currency. So let's just take 2 questions. Let's take him because he's the next one up.
So my question is more directly to Professor Park. You analyzed a lot about Chinese in Africa, but there's also a growing trend of African people in China, which from some statistics shows that in the city of Guangzhou, one of the largest cities in China, there are over 200,000 African people in the city right now. And that has been causing a lot of social and political changes in the city and just in the public opinion in general. So from the perspective of African people you met, what are the reaction of African people going to China?
All right, I think you should answer those questions because those seem like the only 2 questions. And then I think our time will be up.
So, yeah, if I had the whole day, I could go into Africans in China as well. We were actually talking about it at lunch a little bit. The number that you cite is way over a huge overestimate. So a couple things. Africans have been going out and looking for opportunities, and before they discovered China, they were in several other countries, but it was mostly to bypass the Chinese middleman in many instances and start buying directly from manufacturers, factories in China. So Guangzhou, but also Yiwu, a couple other towns in the south of China are the largest recipients of Africans. The Chinese state has had a real difficult time trying to figure out how they want to deal with and manage these large numbers of migrants. And in part, in direct response to Chinese kind of official response, often quite racist towards the African immigrants, the numbers have been very, very fluid, and they've gone down significantly in the last several years because of that. In the same way that Chinese migrants moved to Africa to try to fulfill their dreams, Africans are doing the same thing. I mean, if you're looking at rationale for why they're moving overseas, they talk. There's a film called Guangzhou Dream Factory that came out a few years ago. It was produced by Christian Badgley and Erica Marcus, and they interview a number of Africans. The Africans in China tend to fall into 3 categories. There's students and diplomats who are there temporarily. There are short-term traders who go in for a few days or a few weeks to purchase and then leave again. And then there are people who have made longer-term commitments to stay, but even if they could, they're not allowed to stay for longer than 3 to 6 months at a time because of the visa situation. The photo that I showed actually of the Chinese woman and the mixed-race children, that's actually a photo from Guangzhou. And a lot of the couples that have formed there are in China and not in Africa. But basically the movie, Guangzhou Dream Factory, talks about how there are people who have these dreams, but because of the lack of infrastructure, particularly electricity, and lack of opportunities in Africa, some of these people are going to China to try to become successful and fulfill their dreams.
Well, very quickly, the wages for miners are paid in the local currency, kwacha. And during the crisis, there was no strike because everybody was panicking that some of the mines were closed, and so people were just trying to hang on to their jobs, and there has been no demand to get the wages paid in U.S. dollars. But strikes are rampant on the copper belt.
Thank you, everybody.